is that I grew up and my family home was in Lewisburg over in Union County. So not very far from you. I am very aware that when I was growing up, which is, a long time ago, for a long time, I never heard anything about the coal country or the anthracite. That was never mentioned. People over in Lewisburg, you didn't know it existed. So when I discovered the Molly Maguires and I found out that, the hangings were in Sunbury, the last hangings, executions were just 9 miles down the river, the Susquehanna, I was like, oh, how come I didn't know about this? But since the, 1870s, they have been covered over with, myth and rumor and stories. And this has lasted a really long time. I remember not very many years ago reading about how one of the top labor union leaders, somebody older than me in the state, someone, who had some political power, getting the governor and the legislature to finally grant a pardon to his ancestor, who I believe was Jack Kehoe, the supposed leader of the Molly Maguires, who was hanged by the neck until dead, insisting that he had never done the murder for which he was hanged. And so it's a real tug of war. So what I want to basically tell you about is this book, which is about as good as history ever gets, making sense of the Molly Maguires. And, it's a big, thick history book, but it's good because it isn't a simple story at all. In the 1860s and 1870s, the anthracite coal fields of Pennsylvania, which is where you're sitting, drew national attention for their violence. After a series of assaults and killings, deep-rooted fears of a secret Irish terrorist organization hardened into certainty. 16 men were assassinated, most of them mine officials, and there were numerous beatings and acts of industrial sabotage. The culprits, it was believed, were members of the Molly Maguires, an oath-bound secret society imported from Ireland. Pinkerton detectives were sent into the anthracite district undercover, men of Irish birth with an Irish accent. And the hunt for the Molly Maguires culminated in a series of showcase trials. 20 Irishmen were convicted of a range of heinous crimes and sentenced to be hanged. Their trials and executions were the spectacular climax to a singular episode in American history, one that remains shrouded in ambiguity. And then he goes on to say that they have been depicted in every imaginable way, from sociopaths, which is a nice word for crazy murderers, people with no morality, and terrorists at one end of the spectrum, to innocent victims and proletarian revolutionaries, working class heroes, actually, at the other. But ever since the 1870s, one specific narrative has been dominant, that the Molly Maguires were inherently evil Irishmen who terrorized the anthracite region for 2 decades before being brought to justice by the heroic exploits of James McFarland, a Pinkerton detective. Okay, so that's how the book begins. What I have to move on to is 2 pages later. Historians can never know for certain who and what the Molly Maguires were, and to accept the hostile accounts of contemporary observers at face value is at best naive. And by contemporary observers, he means, first of all, paid informants, men who, for for real money, or because this is the way they're going to save their necks, tell stories, slant the truth, or make things up, or journalists looking to, journalists can say anything they want and publish it, especially in an atmosphere where the Irish Catholics are seen as inherently violent and dangerous. And that is how much, a very large part of America saw them at that time in the 19th century. Now, then he goes on the right, he says, this is a problem. The Molly Maguires themselves left virtually no evidence of their existence, let alone their names and motivation. We don't have someone saying, who somehow survived 40 years later saying, okay, I'm going to tell you what was really going on here. We really don't know. Supposedly, they must have existed because we do have, this is what I wanted to put up on the screen. Let me see if you can see this. We have this. See, yeah, this is the list of mine officials, political leaders, mostly, mine company officials who were killed, including one, a mine watchman in Shamokin. There was violence for sure, but we don't know much more than that for sure. We can't say that every one of those men that was hanged was a Molly Maguire. And the the claim was, and all of these, the witnesses who testified said, well, they're a secret society. When I say secret society, we're not talking like a fraternity at a college. We're talking, oath bound. Like you've, I guess you could say sort of like the mafia, except it's not a criminal organization. It's like you will under no circumstance ever describe this organization. The claim was that they were inside a public organization, which still exists today, the Ancient Order of Hibernians. But I mean, the St. Patrick's Day Parade in New York City, which I suspect you guys may have heard of, is organized by the Ancient Order of Hibernians. This is the great traditional Irish fraternal society. And they had lodges all around the region where you are. And what was claimed in court was that inside those AOH lodges was this secret group of very violent men. This is as much as we can say for sure. There were these killings. There were probably, a lot of places, there were, these men knew how to use explosives. Miners can know how to use explosives. I will note that everywhere in the world you look, whether in Russia or South Africa or the American West, miners have tended to be one of the most militant and politically radical group of workers in the world. That's just a given. I think it's because of the conditions of the work, because it's so dangerous and it requires so much solidarity among the workers themselves. And if you looked at the total number of men killed in mine collapses in the US, we're talking a lot. So, and it's incredibly exploitative. I don't have any trouble at all calling this a form of class struggle. This is workers against, the foremen and the employers. The one other thing that now I want to talk, I'm showing you how complicated this history is, not like the whole story. Okay. Um, what puts a special angle on it is the ethnic element. The most miners actually then, and in many places within the mine itself, there's a hierarchy. There's the person who really knows how to put the charges to, blow up a section of coal face or whatever it is. And then the people who work for him, and then the breaker boys, go over to Eckley Miners Village, the 8-year-olds sitting on top of huge chutes, picking out the rocks from the coal. So the mine officials and the most skilled workers tended to be Englishmen and especially Welshmen. And the Welsh and the Irish have had historically very bad relationships. The Welsh are fiercely Protestant. And a lot of the violence and the tension here was between the Irishmen, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, who they are at the bottom, and the Welsh and English above them. So there's a very strong ethnic and religious element to this, but that does not explain it. It is basically, in my view, certainly, and it is about workers and the exploitation and their very violent response, like we're going to push back against you. So that is sort of the setup for who they were. And, at a certain point, the coal and iron companies, which are enormously powerful in Pennsylvania, hire detectives, men who appear to be who are Irish, to go in and infiltrate, and then come out and say in court, I saw him do this, I saw him plant that bomb, I saw him beat this man to death or shoot this mine official, and then that's it. The juries convict them. I actually want to note here, this is something that's always stuck in my mind as a Pennsylvanian. Into the 1930s, which I know sounds a long way away, but not so much for me, there was an entire separate state police force called the Coal and Iron Police. This is a state police force paid for by the coal and iron companies. They paid for them. And their job was to beat heads in places like where you are now. And they were finally got rid of them in the 30s during the New Deal era. But the Eastern European workers who in the steel towns, they're mostly Europeans. They call them the Cossacks because these are, and they were a state police force. They weren't private police. So they had the state behind them, and their job is to break a strike through violence. So this is a rough world. Now, I'm coming toward the end of this. What this book did, which is for me very fascinating, was he said, well, who are these people really? Let's go and look at where they come from, not look at the US. Let's consider what kind of Irishmen are they and where did they get this from? So in Ireland, from about 1760 to 1850, a whole tradition developed around the island of secret societies that carry out, and I don't have anything to put up, what you know, academics have made up a term, retributive, which is a nice way of saying vengeance, retributive violence. You do this to us, we do that to you. In Ireland, the subjects of this retributive violence, which was very well known, were landlords, but especially the people who work for the landlords, the bailiffs and agents who collect the rents and throw people, desperately poor people, out of their, off their land. And there was a lot, of all kinds, killing, somebody you kicked off the land so they can pasture sheep and cows. Well, those sheep and cows end up dead. And somebody gets his head punched in, and somebody who made a deal with the landlord. There were three major groups sort of successively. There were the white boys, that's one word, white boys, that does not refer to someone being white or skin color, which had no meaning in Ireland at the time. White boys, I don't know. And these are groups that would tend to dress up and put on costumes. The ribbon men, white boys, ribbon men, and then eventually the Molly Maguires. And apparently Molly Maguire was a kind of mythical Irish woman who basically said, where is the bread for my children? How do I feed these starving children? So the Molly Maguires would dress up. They, put on something to shield their identity, black or white paint over their faces. They'd cover themselves up and they would go and, do some damage. Now, so this is a powerful secret society tradition of rural violence that gets imported into America. And what this historian, this great historian, Kevin Kenny, who's at New York University, said, well, actually, I mean, the Molly Maguires are almost a fairly unique version of this Irish retributive justice being brought to America. There are not any other examples. Why is that? Okay, so this is where my talk gets to. It turns out, he looked at the names, and it turns out that to the extent you take the men who were tried or named in all these trials and you trace them back, a lot of that's by names because people don't come from one part of Ireland, they come from a particular county. And if you were Irish and you could talk to your great grandparents, they would say, no, we're not, we're from Kerry, we're from West Cork, we're from Meath. They would know exactly where they were from, not from Ireland as a whole. It turned out that to the extent we can identify people who probably were Molly Maguires, a really large percentage of them were from Donegal in Northwest Ireland. The most absolutely, when you read about this, I mean, as poor can be, starving poor, Irish speaking, not English speaking, and if you've ever heard the Irish language, it sounds, the one time I heard it in Ireland, the first time I heard it, I'm going to say this, it sounded like Chinese. It was sing-song. It was completely unlike English. So the most Irish-speaking, desperately poor, way out on the Atlantic in Donegal. Donegal's the northwest part of Ireland. So this is where I'm going to conclude. The names, this is how they do it. O'Donnell, Gallagher, Sweeney, Boyle, Duffy, McGeehan, and Mulhern. O'Donnell, Gallagher, Sweeney, Boyle, Duffy, McGeehan, Mulhern. Those are not names. You don't find those names in West Cork, where I've spent most of my time, or maybe even in Mayo, where my people were from, County Mayo, also very poor. So he said, actually, it's this particular, very distinctive part, poorer than almost anywhere else, Irish speaking in Donegal. That's where these Mollies came from. They called them, we called Mollies. And they seem to, that's what makes them kind of distinctive. So that's what I wanted to tell you about. It's an example of, an historian going and saying, well, let's figure out who these people really are, where are they coming from. And that's what we know, other than all this testimony, which is, a very mixed bag. And the fact that 20 of them were hanged by the neck until dead. So this is the final thing that is wild. Um, I don't know if you've ever heard of Sean Connery, the actor. He was the first James Bond. So, you've heard of James Bond, right? Well, the first James Bond movies, the first 10 or so, and it made him an international star. He's James Bond. You know what I'm talking about, right? As cool as can be. He's English. He's a spy. He dresses well. Well, Sean Connery was a dirt poor Irishman, grew up in Scotland. When he stopped making the Bond movies in 1970, he made a movie called Molly Maguires, and it was shot in the Eckley Miners Village near you. And it's really good. It's it's not strictly accurate. I mean, it's a movie. It's a Hollywood movie, but it is actually. I was going to show you a scene from it. The scene where the guy who is, the agent of the Pinkertons, who's an Irishman, comes into a bar, and there they are, and he's going to prove himself. It's a great scene, but because I can't figure out how to share screen. But if you want to know more, a sort of an idea of what this was like, that movie, Molly Maguires, it's a good movie.